Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. Today's video is part 2 of my story about Torgsin, a retail chain established in 1930s in the Soviet Union to trade with foreign tourists and foreign specialists. You can find a link to part 1 in the comment sections below this video. Before we begin, a quick reminder, Torgsin was an abbreviation of 3 words, Torg, торговля, с, with, иностранцами, in, Torgsin. The main reason for creating special stores for the foreigners was obviously Soviet government's desperate need for the foreign currencies. But I think Soviet government also realized that it will be hard to retain foreign specialists that came to the Soviet Union to build new factories if they realize there's nothing to buy in the regular Soviet stores. This is how American Robert Robertson described his experience walking in the Soviet store in Leningrad in 1930. By the end of the morning, I had grown tired of exploring Russia's past. After lunch at the hotel, I set out on my own tour in search of present-day Russia. I discovered a contrast. I walked along the streets and peered into many shops. Without exception, they were clean, but they were also nearly empty. The shelves were bare. No sugar, no eggs, no ham, no cheese, none of the common items we had just been served at the morning's breakfast. In fact, the only goods I saw in abundance were matches and jars of mustard. There were also a few loaves of bread for sale here and there. In a clothing store which carried merchandise worse than what you might find in that consignment shop on a Skid Row in Manhattan, the fabric was so incredibly shoddy that the threads were unraveling and the colors had faded. The designs were also very primitive. I got the sense that Russia was a poor, struggling country. Fortunately, the people on the streets seemed well enough fed and no one was begging. The very first Torgsin store was opened in July of 1930. Initially, they were placed only in the large Soviet cities like Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and Kharkiv. The whole system of selling goods at Torgsin was quite cumbersome. First of all, the foreign customer had to trade his currency, like American dollars or British pounds, for the special Torgsin currency, Torgsin ruble. 1 Torgsin ruble was equal to 1 gold ruble, which was used in the official Soviet rate of exchange. That meant that 1 Torgsin ruble was equal 6 Soviet rubles officially, but on the black market, the price for 1 Torgsin monopoly money was reaching 60 rubles. And now let's talk about magical metamorphosis when Torgsin turned from the tool of extracting some foreign currency from the foreigners into the literally a gold mine. As I mentioned in my previous video about Torgsin, by 1930-1931, Soviet Union was in big trouble. In previous years, the Soviets signed hundreds of contracts purchasing factories, technology, and hiring thousands of foreign specialists. We are talking about hundreds of millions of golden rubles in those contracts, and the plan was to pay with grain and other commodities. But the crisis of 1929 and the following collapse in commodity prices blew a giant hole in that plan. So now Soviets desperately needed more grain or more gold. Just to give you an example, in 1926, the Soviet Union debt was a total of 420 million golden rubles. The main creditor was Germany. In 1931, 5 years later, the debt exploded to 1.4 billion golden rubles. The Soviet government was so desperate that in 1930 they started massive sales and auctions of the art from museums and libraries in the Soviet Union, as well as the sales of the precious icons from the Russian churches. Meanwhile, the Torgsin was doing its thing and was selling goods to the foreigners in exchange for the foreign currency. At some point, the central office of Torgsin began receiving messages from the stores as far as Odessa requesting, hey, we have people coming in the stores and they asking, can they trade their golden coins from the Tsar Russia During the Tsar regime, we had 10 ruble golden coin, 5 ruble golden coin, I think even 1 ruble and 50 kopecks. So people were getting desperate looking for food, and they were asking if they can trade their gold coins for the food items available in Torgsin. So now we're talking about Soviet citizens, not foreign specialists that try to buy goods at Torgsin. What happened next is quite amazing because usually the system of central planning and socialist economy, when you don't have profit chasing, any decision takes forever. But in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the first Torgsin store opened in July of 1930. Less than a year later, in June of 1931, it was made a decision, yes, we can accept golden coins from anyone in exchange for goods in Torgsin. It was really quick. And the business was so good that less than 6 months later, on November 3rd, 1931, the Torgsin got permission to trade food for any golden items. So rings, chains, anything that contained gold, now you can bring into Torgsin, get traded for the local Torgsin rubles, and purchase food or any other items. Later, the list was expanded again. Now, silver coins were accepted, and any items containing silver, platinum, or other precious metals was accepted in Torgsin in exchange for food. Eventually, 80% of the whole profit in Torgsin was made not from trading with foreigners for the foreign currency, but by trading with Soviet citizens, taking their gold and silver and in exchange for food. As I mentioned in my first Torgsin video, Soviet Union experienced such a severe shortage of food by 1930s that the card-based ration system was reinstalled, and people weren't able to purchase bread and other food items in the stores. Sure, party elites were getting their food rations, military was getting their food rations, quite a few workers, but for example, peasants received no food cards at all. It was up to them where they're going to find food to survive. And with the mass hunger and starvation of 1931 and 1932, people were forced to give up their possessions, their gold rings, wedding rings, anything that contained precious metals in exchange for basic foods. So pretty much every Torgsin store had a couple of guys who were in charge of giving you an estimate how much your rings are worth. And they didn't care about the values, like maybe it's some, really old, very special ring. They just care about quality of gold and the weight, because everything was destroyed and melted into the golden bricks to be sold to the West. And the business of trading food for gold was so profitable for the Soviet government that the amount of Torgsin shops in the country exploded. It reached 1,500 at its peak. For example, in January of 1933, there were only 74 Torgsin shops in Ukraine. By July of the same year, so in 6 months, it went up to 249, so tripled in mere 6 months. As Professor Elena Sokina described, Torgsin was a capitalist enterprise of the socialist trade. The Soviet government was capitalizing on a famine. Almost 80% of all the goods sold by Torgsin were the food categories, mostly flour and cereals, and 60% of that was bread categories. Just people were trying to survive and just trading gold for bread. Just in 1933, Torgsin extracted 45 tons of pure gold and 1,400 tons of silver from the population. In comparison, mining in 1933 produced only 50 tons of gold. 45 tons of gold came from population and 50 tons from mining of gold in the Soviet Union. In 5 years of being in business, the Torgsin extracted 220 tons of pure gold, trading it for cereals, flour, fish, and bread. Meanwhile, mining brought 294 tons of gold. You also need to know that Torgsin paid below the world prices for gold and above world prices for bread. This is what I called Stalin's scissors. According to some calculations, the Torgsin underpaid around 2 billion rubles to the people that brought their gold. So for quite a few years, the Torgsin was the most profitable industry in the Soviet Union. and that's why that amount of stores exploded to 1,500. But when the food situation in the Soviet Union improved and the card system was cancelled, suddenly Torgsin became unprofitable, and it was shut down in 1936. Some Torgsin's markups were insane comparing with world prices. For example, butter was sold at 170% higher price than the world price. Sugar and oils 330% higher. I also would like to mention Torgsin's top managers. There were 3 of them. Moisey Israelovich Shklyar was running Torgsin between 1931 and 1932. Artur Karlovich Stashevsky was in charge of Torgsin between 1932 and 1934. And Mikhail Abramovich Levinson was the last manager of Torgsin between 1934 and 1936. Fun fact, only Moisey Shklyar survived and died as an old guy. Artur Stashevsky was executed in 1937, and Mikhail Levinson was executed 1 year later in 1938. And I want to mention once again that in 5 years of its operation, Torgsin extracted more than 220 tons of pure gold from the Soviet population, and it was enough to cover more than 1/5 of all the imports in the Soviet Union during the first 5-year plan. If you found Torgsin topic interesting, I would recommend to watch Russian TV series called Torgsin. I will post the link in the comment section. And once again, I would like to thank Professor Elena Sokina, who helped me a lot with creating this video. She answered a lot of my questions about Torgsin. And if you're interested to learn more about Torgsin, I would strongly recommend her book, which is called Stalin's Quest for Gold. It's available on Amazon. Okay, my friends, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching Ushanka Show, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.